Okay, so I'm going to mute everybody. You can always unmute yourselves afterwards. Okay. Hi, good morning. All right, so we're studying the Kuzari first, and then we'll do a little bit on the Parsha and Shavuos, more Shavuos than the Parsha, because it's a 3-day Yontif coming up. So why don't we get started? We were talking about the 4-letter name of God, the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, and its unique feature, and the uniqueness to the Jewish faith. There really is no other religion that has this unique name. Even the monotheistic faiths do not have Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, this tetragrammaton, this 4-letter name of God. What Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was telling us in the last discussion is that we use this name in a borrowed sense and it's for the very same reason that this name is unique to Jewish tradition, is because it is only a name that is understood by the prophet who experiences God face to face in a face-to-face revelation. That those letters, Yud, Kei, Vav, Kei, they impart some kind of manifestation of God's innateness, not God in all of his innateness, that's not comprehensible to the human mind, but whatever the human being is capable of understanding in an experiential encounter or exposure to the Ribono Shel Olam, that is described with those 4 letters. When we use those 4 letters, we use them in a borrowed sense, which means I have never had that experience, but I use the name as a way of sort of connecting myself to my tradition, to my ancestors who had that prophetic experience, even though I never did. So that's why we use that 4-letter name. And it's sort of almost an affirmation that I have, in a sense, the capability at some point in my future, maybe to become a prophet and to connect with that name in some way. And there is coffee and tea for those who are live, if anyone would like. It's all set up. Oh, because it's not a kuf, it's a hay. It's a hay. So, yeah. Yes, that's true. That's true. Yeah. So there's all different conventions, I suppose. Yeah. Now, what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was also started to tell us is that sometimes we use this 4-letter name in a borrowed sense, not only for us non-prophets, but even prophets will use it in a borrowed sense to assign certain things that are sort of associated with God's divinity. They will call that Yud-Kei Vav-Kei as well. In other words, they will sort of designate even physical objects as Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, or the Shekhinah as Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim says that the term Shekhinah is sometimes used to describe a physical manifestation of God's presence, like a cloud or something like that. That can be assigned with the name of God, even though it's not God. And so Rabbi Yehuda Halevi just takes that one step further and says sometimes you'll assign a physical object with the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, not because you believe that that is God, but rather you believe that that object is associated in some way with God. Some even call the ark Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, as when they said, Kuma Hashem, Yafutsu Oyevecha. Arise, O God, and let your enemies be scattered. When did the Jews say that? Not only when we're in shul, but Kuma Hashem Yafutsu Oyevecha. Arise, God, so your enemies will be scattered. So we're going to read about that in just a couple of weeks in the Torah reading. It's in Parshat Bahalotcha, Vayihi bin Soa Ha'aron, Vayomer Moshe, that when the ark of God would travel in the desert, Moshe would say, Kuma Hashem, arise, O God. Now, he's not telling God to get up, right? Because that's audacious, right? To presume that God is lying down or resting. That's not what Moshe means when he says Kuma Hashem. He's referring to the ark, but he calls the ark with the name of Hashem. And that's where we are on page 395 in the Kuzari. Some even call the ark Yud Kei Vav Kei, as when they say Kuma Hashem when the ark was lifted, and Uvenucho Yomar, and when the ark would rest, they would say Shuva Hashem Rivavos Alfeso, return, O God, to the myriads of Israel. Which means that we're not saying that God is returning, God is not spatially confined, but it's a reference to the ark of Hashem. And likewise, God has ascended with the blast. Allah Elokim Bisru'ah, Hashem B'kol Shofar. That pasuk is from Tehillim, but it should be familiar because we say it 7 times as part of that chapter of Tehillim that we recite 7 times before Tekiyah Shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Okay, and again, God is not spatially confined. God neither goes up or goes down, and therefore we're referring to the sound of the shofar, which is associated with God. In all these instances, they were really referring to the ark of Hashem. Okay. Other prophets describe the relationship and the bond between Israel and God by including the name Yud Kei Vav Kei. So another way of using this name in a borrowed sense is by describing the bond between God and Israel as Yud Kei Vav Kei. Not God himself, but the bond, the relationship that exists between God and Israel as that name as well. This is what is meant by the words, Halo misanecha Hashem esna. Those who hate you, God, I shall hate. Now, what does that mean? Those who hate you, God, I shall hate. What are we really referring to in that verse? This is a verse from Tehillim, and what do you think it means when it says, "Those who hate you, God, I shall hate"? Well, it could mean quite literally people who are angry at God and deliberately go against God and sin. I will hate those people. But that's not what the way Rabbi Yehuda Halevi understands it. He says, since no human being really hates God, what is really meant is that it refers to the special relationship between God and Israel, and is really short for the name of God, the covenant of God, or the Torah of God, meaning that the Jewish people represent a certain message to mankind. And those who hate that message, those who hate what the Jews stand for, and those who hate what the Torah represents, the message of the Bible, right? Those are the ones that I shall despise. I shall hate those who hate, not you, literally God. That's not something that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is really thinking about. He doesn't think that people actually hate God. People hate the burden that is placed upon people who believe that God gave us a specific message. That's what it means that I will hate those who hate you. Those who try to revile and condemn and criticize the Torah, those are the people that I shall have enmity towards. Because there can be no such connection between him and any, I'm sorry, I skipped a line. The other nations are jealous of this special relationship that's implied in the sentence, because there can be no such connection between God and any idolatrous nation. And so that's the reason for why there are people who have an enmity or anti-Semitism towards the Jewish people, is because they are resentful of not so much the chosenness of the Jewish people, but the message of the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is really born more out of this sense of higher conscience and higher calling that the Jewish people represent for all of humanity. Yes, it's true that people use the canard of, chosenness as a reason for anti-Semitism, but it's not really true. Every religion has some kind of supersessionist, exceptionalist kind of theology. Ask a Muslim who's the most special people of the world. Say it's the Muslims. Everyone else is a kafir. Everyone else is an infidel. Ask a Christian who is chosen by God. It's those who adhere to Yashka, right? So the Jews are not exceptional in their exceptionalism. There's no exceptionalism in exceptionalism, I guess you could say. There's nothing exceptional about stating that you're exceptional. Every religion makes that claim that there's something special about those who get it, about those who adhere to the faith that we believe is the most correct faith. But at the same time, the resentment against the Jewish people in particular comes from, and perhaps now it's extended to all religion, comes from that sense of conscience that religion preaches and says that you do have a higher responsibility, you do have a moral calling. There is a consequence to one's behavior. That's not a message that is easy to swallow. It's not a message that's very popular, especially not today. Today, one is very popular if one espouses atheism and that there's nothing left after you die, and that we are just a product of billions of years of evolution, and we're here for just a few years, and then that's it. There's nothing left. That's really the resounding message in today's world. It's why it's so difficult. It's why it's so difficult to get across a message that is religious in nature. It's why outreach, what we call kiruv, is a very, very difficult project in today's world. It's just really in the last a few decades that it has become increasingly more difficult. As many commentaries point out, there are times when there will be greater levels of success and greater levels of the lack of success, depending upon the winds of the culture where we find ourselves. When the winds are blowing in one direction against religion, it's going to be very hard to broach this message with people who are not used to hearing it. But that's really the import of what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is talking about over here in describing how the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei is used. It is not talking about people who know God and hate him. That's not really what it's talking about. It's talking about people who are resentful of the message of those who speak in the name of God. And therefore, when you say, Halo misanecha Hashem, esna, I will hate or bear enmity or malice towards those who hate you. It's not that they hate you, God. It's that they hate your message, or the message that you've charged us to share with the rest of the world. Okay. And so anyone want to comment on that at this point? Okay. God bestows his light only upon the elite people and the possessors of the true religion. And here, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi espouses a very strong kind of exceptionalism within the Jewish people. He has this theme recurring throughout Sefer Kuzari, that prophecy can only abound among the Jewish people. And this concept of revelation, of divine revelation, can only abound within the Jewish people. It's a very controversial statement, but it's certainly worthwhile thinking about when we think about the holiday of Shavuos that we are about to celebrate, because it really is a commemoration of a one-time revelation of the Torah that took place in front of specifically one population of people, according to our tradition. And one of the things that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi challenges elsewhere in the Kuzari is, if the Torah is so important, why wasn't this revelation made to the entire world? It's a valid question. And God chose to give the Torah. Why did he only give it to one select family of mankind? Why not give the Torah to everybody? What do you think about that? Well, certainly the Medrash tells us that according to the Medrash, God went to all the other nations and offered them the Torah. But what does that Medrash really mean? I mean, you could interpret it. I mean, essentially, you're citing the Medrash accurately, and you're basically suggesting that the Medrash says that God did offer the Torah to the entire world and they turned it down. Okay, but the Jews said, "Na'aseh v'nishma," we will do and we will hear. How do you understand that Medrash? Did this historically take place? Was it a metaphysical occurrence that took place in the heavens? Did God actually send a prophet to the other nations of the ancient world and offer them to come and join us in the Sinai desert and take part in the receiving of the Torah? What do you think actually happened? I mean, it is possible, I suppose it is possible to interpret that Medrash in its most literal sense, although we have no historical record of that ever happening, right? Neither in our writings or in writings that are independent to corroborate it. But even in our own literature, we don't have a historical record of prophets sent by Moshe Rabbeinu to go out to sort of send out messengers to all of the civilized nations of the world in that region. Forget about Asia and the New World for a second, or Africa. But let's just talk about the Middle East, right? There were no messengers sent out to the other nations, to the Philistines, to the Canaanites, and offering them a formal invitation. Please join us in the Sinai desert when we're going to receive the Torah. Yes. Whoever connects with it takes it upon themselves. But one of the cornerstones of our faith, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but one of the cornerstones of our faith is that there actually was an event at Mount Sinai. People who convert are said to have been there. Right. Okay. So perhaps what you're, maybe just to extend what you're suggesting, is that the Torah was given to for the entire world to attach itself to, but it was given to one specific population of people, and this people was charged with sharing it with the rest of the world. And they already had sort of either the qualities or the historical connection to that heritage.
Historical, so he knew, continuously that Abraham's children have, as you're saying, what's in them to carry on what needs to be done in the world to represent God.
Correct, but it is a bit circular, right? In other words, at some point you have to ask yourself the question, why didn't God enable all of humankind to be able to do that, to perpetuate the message of God?
Going back to the garden with Nebo, like if we given free choice, then
yeah, ultimately it has to. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi answers this question, and I don't remember offhand where the citation is, but he ultimately says that the structure of our world is based upon small percentages acting as a representation of the larger whole. He says his analogy is the tree. The mass of a tree, a tree could weigh a ton, but the produce that is grown on the tree weighs a fraction of the entire tree, or it has a fraction of the mass of an entire tree. Yes. So you have a tree, an apple tree, an orange tree that may bear hundreds and hundreds of apples at a time. But you have the root system, you have the trunk and the bark and the branches and the leaves. Why do they exist? Why do they at all exist? Well, of course, the answer is that if they didn't exist, the apples could not grow, right? So then that leads to the next question. Why did God create a world where there is so much secondary product to produce the fruit? Why couldn't fruit just grow from the ground like tomatoes? Why do we need trees? And by the way, Shavuos is the Rosh Hashanah, or is the day of judgment for trees, as we're going to see momentarily. It's mankind is judged for its produce on Shavuos. And that's actually the second part of our discussion today. Maybe this is a good segue into our discussion about Shavuos. Shavuos is a time of judgment for trees. And that's why it's not a coincidence that Shavuos is sort of compared by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi to a tree. Is that a tree has fruit, but the fruit is only a small percentage of the totality of the tree. And yet God structured the world in a way that everything that exists, even in the natural order, there's a small amount that is the ultimate product, but so much goes into that product in order for it to be produced. And that exists in many different iterations of nature, not only in plant life, but in animal life as well. So you see that there's a pattern in creation that sometimes the fruit is a small percentage of everything else that goes into making the fruit. Does that mean that the other items that went into making the fruit are superfluous, unnecessary? No, without them, the fruit could not grow. So that's how Rabbi Yehuda Halevi understands the role of the Jewish people. We're the fruit of the tree. Yeah. The Jewish people are the fruit of the tree. We're a bunch of fruits. Everyone else in the world is the branches, the trunk, the leaves, the bark. That's right. I'm saying that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is saying that we're the fruit. The fruit of the tree. Now, what does that mean? And I don't know what ultimately how we're going to be able to define it. Perhaps not today, but what I would say is that it does certainly create a necessary, vital connection between the Jewish people and the rest of the world. We cannot just separate ourselves and say we don't care about the rest of the world. If the rest of the world is ill, right? If the tree gets disease, then the fruit will become diseased as well, right? And if someone chooses to chop down the tree, the fruit can't say, what do I care? No one chopped me down, they just chopped down the trunk. Well, that's not going to work either, right? And if someone were to say, well, what do I care about what happens to the leaves when there's a hailstorm? Doesn't affect the fruit, it was protected. It doesn't work, okay? So the analogy that he gives is to suggest that the ultimate objective of God's creation of the world was for the fruit, which means that God was looking for a certain segment of mankind to connect to and to give the Torah to. This does not mean that no one has the ability to connect and become fruit themselves. Like you said, Aviva, we have converts, and the Torah's message ultimately permeates through and has permeated historically throughout and reverberated throughout the world. But at the same time, this kind of exceptionalist attitude that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi has certainly does designate the Jewish people as being distinct and different from the rest of humankind because of the Torah that God gave to us. And it also answers the question, why did God only reveal himself to only one segment of mankind? And either it's because the rest of mankind was not meant for that purpose, or not capable of that purpose. However you want to phrase it, you're going to have to come up with some kind of structure to be able to find comfort on the one hand that there's a certain aspect of chosenness about the Jewish people, and at the same time reconcile this very uncomfortable kind of theology of a certain kind of exceptionalism within the Jewish people. And I haven't formulated it perfectly yet. And certainly I would submit to you that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, on the spectrum of the great medieval Jewish thinkers who address this issue about Jewish exceptionalism, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is on the far right end of the spectrum. He's a hard exceptionalist, basically saying there's an inherent difference between the Jew and everybody else. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have universalists. Like, so Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is a great right-wing particularist, but the Rambam is a very left-wing universalist and says that there's nothing exceptional at all about the Jewish people other than the responsibility that we have to fulfill the mitzvot. But every human being is capable of a higher calling and attachment to God. So just bear that in mind. But for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, for sure, this kind of exceptionalism is very, very much baked into the recipe of what it means to be a Jew.
Rabbi, could we also answer that question? Why was the Torah not presented to other nations? Is because of Abraham. Abraham identified God and spread the word, and the nations around him in the Middle East at that time didn't recognize it and leaned towards idol worship. And that's why, that is the origin of why only the Jewish people would be offered it.
The historical reason, of course, and that's what Karen had suggested. I know it's hard for us to hear the other participants, yes, but Karen had mentioned that as well. It goes back to our ancestors, to our forefathers, who made these ultimate commitments and sacrifices for the sake of God, and that was their reward. It is a bit interesting, and I'll leave you with this, and then we'll go on to our Parsha discussion. It is quite curious that when we look at the promises that God made to Avraham, I don't believe it says explicitly that Hashem promised Avraham that he would give the Torah only to his children, the Jewish people. He promised them that they will be slaves. He promised them they will be redeemed. He promised them great wealth. He promised them the land of Israel. But he doesn't promise them the Torah, which I find to be very interesting. Think about that. I haven't thought it completely through, but there's a lot to percolate in your mind. Okay, sure.
So how is that different from this word in the Torah, gracious, when Moshe says Ishmael gracious? That is the idea, right?
So what is the word? The word bereshis means for the sake of rashis. And what is rashis? Define it. The Jewish people, alternatively, the Torah. So one interpretation is that God created the world for the sake of the Jewish people. And why are the Jewish people exceptional? What makes them exceptional? So perhaps it's the second definition of rashis, is that they were the people destined to receive the Torah. But again, let's not become circular in our thinking. That only begs the question. So why is it that it was bishvil reshit? Why only for the sake of the people of the book? Why not expand the people of the book to all of mankind? That's ultimately the question that we have to still struggle with. And we'll have to come up with some explanation that sort of says God's wisdom does not allow for homogeneity in creation. God's whole system of creation is hierarchical. There's completely a hierarchy. It's not just everything is uniform. There's lower organisms, there's higher organisms, there's things in this world, there's the celestial bodies. The universe is so multitudinous and so multifaceted and so hierarchical in its structure of above, below, less, more, larger, smaller. And then you can go on the macro level, you can go on the microscopic level. There's so much that is multi-tiered and multi-leveled. And apparently humanity, at least as far as the Torah function or the Torah, the role of the Torah within mankind is also multi-tiered. Okay, so how do I understand the Medrash? Yeah, how should one understand them? I don't think that the Medrash is literal. There are some Meforshim who do understand it literally, that literally messengers went out to all the different nations and offered them the Torah. I don't think that that's actually, we have no record of that ever happening. And I don't think that would be accurate to say that it literally happened. I think more likely is that, it's the way most Meforshim understand it, is that God, looking at the other nations, saw that they, at that stage of their evolution, of those respective nations, were not capable of receiving a Torah. They were so dissonant in their culture and in their mindset from a Torah system of law, that it just was too, it would have been too incongruent with who they were at the time to present them with the Torah. The Jewish people were malleable because they had just been slaves and they were liberated by God, and also because of the inherent nature that they had inherited from their ancestors. There was something baked into our DNA that enabled us to resonate in some way more with the Torah than with the other nations at the time. Does that mean that this is a permanent state, that mankind is forever condemned to never be able to resonate with the Torah? No, I mean, to witness, Christians and Muslims, to one degree or another, have accepted Torah principles as part of their lives. And that medrash, which says that when God first went to Edom and said, it says in the Torah, you're not allowed to kill. And Edom said, well, we can't possibly do that because we're a nation of murderers. That medrash is a polemic against the bloodlust that existed within the Western world at that time. Even people who proclaimed to be devoutly religious were still persecuting Jews on the cross, and or in the name of the cross. And when it says that God went to Yishmael and he said, it says, "Do not steal," and Yishmael said, "Well, all of our whole culture is built upon stealing." That was a polemic against the Muslim world, who was known for dishonest dealings at that time. But that doesn't mean that was meant to be a permanent state. Chazal are commenting on cultures that existed in the times that they were familiar with, and that as communities, as society, as civilization evolves, all of humankind becomes more resonant with a higher level of morality and ethics. Doesn't mean that everyone evolves the same, and it doesn't mean that civilization evolves towards all of the Torah's ideals. Sometimes it evolves away from certain ideals that are contained in the Torah for the sake of other prevailing moral ideas that may be more in vogue in the 21st century. Yeah, I hope I don't get canceled. Yeah, right. Yeah, well,
I mean, our kids all come in school, rattling it off. So what is that telling them?
well, again, this is a very good question. One of the difficulties, you raise maybe this is more important of a discussion than what I had planned, but Mrs. Sachachevsky is asking, our children come home with this medrash without really getting any significant, let's say, qualifications to the medrash, or to try and unpack it or explain it properly. And that's perhaps where some of the bigotry within our people comes from, is that when we teach children medrash on a superficial level, without explaining to them that all human beings are exceptional. This is what I spoke about on Shabbos. I talked about, when, we talked about the shooting that happened in Texas last week, the great tragedy. When human life is devalued, there are a number of things that you have to look at within your culture to find out, why is there a devaluation of human life? Part of it is, abortion, part of it is euthanasia. We can go into that direction. We also have to look at the fact that, when you live in a godless society, when you live in a world where people are more and more atheistic, to go back to what I started with, and people just believe that, it's 14 billion years of evolution got us here. And we're here for about 80, 90 years, and sayonara, and that's it. And that's all it is. So then what really is the value of human life? If it's just by fluke that we got to this level of evolution, is there anything remarkable, anything extraordinary about the human condition? And certainly the correct response would not be to say, well, the Jews are different. The rest of mankind may not be extraordinary, but Jews are special because we have the Torah. That would be a very inappropriate response to that challenge, because ultimately then what does it say? The Shlechte Goyim, who cares what happens to them, right? Let them kill each other for all I care. Because if they don't value themselves and they don't have a Torah, what difference does it make? Well, that's a horrible message, right? Would you agree? Doing what?
Saying, oh, Goyim are just Goyim, so I'll kill them all. You don't see that.
Not I'll kill them. I didn't say I'll kill them all. I said let them kill each other. There's a very big difference. Jews are docile by nature because of a centuries-old tradition of being the persecuted one. We are docile not because we will never kill other people, but rather because we never had the opportunity to kill other people. So let's not say, okay, the Jews are so special. But have you ever heard people saying, let the Arabs kill each other? Or let those other Goyim kill each other? Let the Russians kill the Ukrainians for all I care? Because remember what the Ukrainians did during World War II? You never heard that?
Nobody I know says that. I guess there could be people that say it, but I grew up with the tradition of Hakoko Yaakov and the Goyim of the Isa, that not that Jews are docile, but that Jews are not violent.
Yeah, but again, I'm asking you to honestly self-criticize. Really, what's the reason that we're not violent? What is the reason we're not violent?
Because of what I just said, that
I
we're
think-
people
I-
of
I look,
a
I think-
spiritual nature.
I think part of it obviously is because of the Torah that was given to us. There's no question about it. But there have been pretty violent periods in our history, wouldn't you acknowledge? You have to go back pretty far before we were an exiled people. But look at Sefer Shoftim. It's one of the bloodiest books that was ever written. Look at Sefer Shmuel. Look at Sefer Malachim. You look back in the history. Open up a Josephus. There have been plenty of times when Jews have had the ascendant hand, and we have been violent. So yes. Yeah. Yeah, the Jews do have a moral compass. Yeah, it's part of human nature to be violent when the opportunity presents itself. The thing that restricts the Jew, I'm suggesting, is two things, not to the exclusion of the other. Number one, we have a Torah. The Torah has told us that there are limits to human violence. And we have to be compassionate, and we have to love the stranger, and so forth and so on. There's no question that plays a role in our collective consciousness. No question. But the fact that we've been docile for centuries, I don't think you can say is exclusively because of the Torah. Jews have not had an opportunity, by and large, throughout our diaspora existence, to rise up against our captors. We've always, I think it's a combination. I think it's a combination. The point, therefore, is though, there is this attitude that sometimes exists because of this very, very strong emphasis on Jews are different, right? Then when the Goyim want to be violent and act like wilde chayas, let them kill each other. It's got nothing to do with me. It's got nothing to do with us. And when you look at Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's analogy, even though he's this very, very hard particularist, and he does believe in the specialness of the Jewish people, but he still acknowledges that we're the fruit of the tree. And when you're the fruit of the tree, if the tree is diseased, you better be sure that that disease is going to manifest itself in the fruit as well at some point. And if you don't try to address the disease in the tree, then you're only doing so at your own peril. Elsewhere, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says, this is one of his most famous analogies, is that the Jewish people, if all of mankind he doesn't compare mankind to a tree, but he compares mankind to one human body. And the Jewish people are the organ of the heart. We are the heart of all of mankind. You remember that? We learned that, I don't know, umpteen years ago. And we therefore manifest, just like the heart manifests disease in all different parts of the body. So if the person has a cancer in his foot, the heart rate and the blood pressure will be affected, because the heart is the most sensitive of all organs. Similarly, if mankind in any way is diseased spiritually, it'll manifest itself in the Jewish people. So we do have that responsibility to make sure that if there is a malady of culture, a malady of spirit, a disease, so to speak, within mankind, that there is a bloodlust, or there is just malice and hatred and negativity and evil that exists within other segments of humanity, we better be sure that if we don't do something about it, if we don't at least try to do something about it, then it'll be at our doorstep and it'll be affecting us as well. And we've seen many iterations of this. Look at the way that so many of the young generation are being adversely affected by some of the cultural mores of our society today. I just was at the Yishai Rebo concert last night, which was awesome. It was absolutely beautiful to see this man quoting psukim and having children, young people, young adults and children loving songs about becoming close with Hashem. That was beautiful, right? But Rabbi Black, in his introduction, when he introduced on behalf of NCSY, when he talked about kids today, he said, ask your children who their heroes are. And you may not want to know the answer, because so many of the youth today, even those who grow up in observant homes, are listening to hip hop, what's it called? About hip hop, but it's a specific kind of hip hop, which is very violent and misogynistic, and filled with sexual content and so forth. And this is what our kids are following today. And it's not like the music that we were raised with. I'm a child of the 70s, so I'm even post Beatles, but still the music of the 70s was tame by example, by comparison of what our kids have today. I tell my kids all the time, I'm sorry you didn't grow up in the 70s. That was when music was music. But anyway, so if we think that we can escape humanity, we're gravely mistaken. Okay, I've rambled on, and I'm a little bit embarrassed for my rambling, so please excuse me. And now let's talk a little bit about Shavuos, okay? So I'm just going to bring up my screen. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to have to abridge my statements today because of everything that we've spoken about. There is a very interesting section of Gemara, and let me share my screen with you. Okay, let me share my screen. Tanya, we were taught in a Mishnaic text, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer. This particular sage, Rabbi Shimon, states, Ezra, Tikein lahem liyisrael, sheyehu korin klalot shebetorat kohanim kodem atzeret. Ezra ordained Torah readings for the entire year. And he made a specific ordinance that certain parshiot should be read at certain times of the year. He made a rule that the Jews should read the curses that are contained in the book of Devarim. Which parsha contains all those curses in Devarim? Anyone remember? Which parsha? Parshat Ki Tavo. Ki Tavo. It's sort of like at the very end of Devarim. It's got very, very graphic curses of what will happen. It's called the Tochacha, of what will happen to you if you don't follow the way of God. So he ordained that we should read that before Rosh Hashanah, and he also ordained that we should read the klalot that are in the book of Leviticus before Shavuos. What are the curses in the book of Leviticus and Sefer Vayikra? Which parsha? We just read it last Shabbos. Parshat Bechukotai that we just read last Shabbos contains the Tochacha, and so you have to read that before Shavuos. So before Shavuos, you have to learn Parshas Bechukosai, and before Rosh Hashanah, you have to learn Parshas Ki Tavo. In other words, it's not immediately before, but you can't allow Bechukosai to ever come after Shavuos, and you can't allow Ki Tavo to ever come after Rosh Hashanah. My time, what's the reason? So Amar Rabbi v'temer Reish Lakish kidei shetichle hashana v'kiloloteha, in order that the year and its curses should come to an end. And certainly that makes sense when we're talking about Ki Tavo before Rosh Hashanah. Imagine it's Rosh Hashanah, you've just celebrated the new year, and then the very next Shabbos you read Parshas Ki Tavo about all the horrible things that are going to happen. That's incongruous. You want to get all the curses out of the way, make them part of last year, and start the new year without any curses, right? That's the theme. So the Gemara says, I get that. Bishlam Mishnah Torah ika kadesha tichla shana v'kiloloseha, ela shebetorat kohanim atu atzeret Rosh Hashanah. But the curses in Parshas Bechukosai, why do you have to finish that before Shavuos? Since when is Shavuos a new year? Shavuos is not a new year. So the Gemara answers in Atzeret Nami Rosh Hashanah. Shavuos is a new year in one sense. Ditnan uva Atzeret al Perot ha'ilan. Because it says in the Mishnah that on Shavuos, we'll see that Mishnah in just a moment. The Mishnah in Masechet Rosh Hashanah says that on Shavuos, the world is judged for how much fruit it's going to receive for the coming year. Why? Because Shavuos is when the fruit harvest. When does the grain harvest start? Pesach. When does the rainy season start? Sukkot. When is the fruit harvest begin? Like when are farmers in the orchard collecting dates and figs and olives and apples and oranges? The beginning of the summer. That's when you harvest fruit. Okay? So that's when God judges how much fruit is the world going to get for that year. So, and this is based on the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is in source number 2. Ve'arba prakim ha'olam nidon. The world is judged 4 times in the year. The Pesach alatfua. Pesach, the world is judged how much grain it will receive. Ba'atzeret al perot ha'ilan. On Shavuos, the world is judged how much fruit it's going to receive. Rosh Hashanah kol bo'ei ha'olam ovrim lefanav kibnei maron. And on Rosh Hashanah, every single individual passes before God like sheep in a single file line. And then it quotes a pasuk for that. V'chag, and on Sukkot, nidonim al hamayim, the world is judged for how much water it is going to receive. Now, the basic question that many commentaries, including the Tosfos Yantav, ask on this Mishnah is, if every individual is judged on Rosh Hashanah, and how can you tell me that there are other times of judgment that are taking place for fruit, for water, for grain? Shouldn't a person's judgment include all of those things? How can there be separate judgment for how much water and then a separate judgment for the totality of the individual on Rosh Hashanah. So the Tosfos Yom Tov explains that what it means is it's the world versus the individual. The world in its totality will receive X, gallons of water. The world in its totality will receive X bushels of produce. The world in its totality will receive X bushels of grain. How much will I, of those bushels or gallons, will I receive? So that's what the judgment is on Rosh Hashanah. That's the basic understanding. But it gets a little bit more interesting because Tosfos asks the question, if you have to make sure you finish Ki Tavo before Rosh Hashanah, and you have to make sure you finish Bechukotai before Shavuos, why then is it that there's usually a gap between Parshat Ki Tavo and Rosh Hashanah of at least one Shabbos? In other words, Ki Tavo is never the last Parsha of the year. It's usually Nitzavim or Nitzavim Vayelech, okay? And similarly, before Shavuos, we never have Parshas Bechukosai immediately before Shavuos. It's either Bamidbar, that's before Shavuos, like we have this year, and in some rare instances where the next year is a leap year, both Bamidbar and Naso are before Shavuos. So the question is, if it's all about making sure the curses are behind you, why not just lane Ki Tavo as the very last Parsha of the year? And why wasn't Bechukosai this week's Parsha? Could be. So Tosfos asks this question, and Tosfos's answer, it's in source number 5. He says, "Lefish anu rotzin lahapsik v'likrot Shabbat echad kodem Rosh Hashanah v'parsha shelo tehei medaberet biklalot." He says, we want to have one Shabbos to interrupt between the curses and the new year. Shelo lahasmich haklalot Rosh Hashanah. Like you said, Mrs. Sachachevsky, you don't want to put the curses immediately adjacent to Rosh Hashanah. That's also not betamt. It's also not going to be very, very nice, very appropriate. Umitam zeh anu korim b'midbar Sinai kodem atzeret kidei shelo lahasmich haklalot shebechukotai la'atzeret. And Tosfos say that that's exactly the reason why we're not reading Bechukosai this Shabbos, but we want to read Bamidbar adjacent to create a sort of a buffer between curses and the new year of Shavuos. So I just want to bring something to your attention. It's not by chance that Shavuos is also considered to be a new year, because in a sense, Shavuos is a new year for all of the world to determine how much life it's going to get. What do I mean by that? The Gemara says in Masechet Shabbat, on the verse Vayihi Erev Vayihi Voker Yom Hashishi, and it was evening and it was day, the 6th day. That's on the 6th day of creation. So Hey Yetera Lamali, the Gemara asks, what do you mean Yom HaShishi? For all of the other days of creation, it says Yom Echad, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi, Yom Revi'i. Only on the 6th day, it says Yom HaShishi, the 6th day, with the definite article, Hey. So why is that? This teaches me that God made a deal or made a condition with all of creation. And he said to all components of creation, if the Jews will receive the Torah on the 6th, not the 6th day, but rather the 6th of Sivan, then the world will endure. But if not, the world will be returned back to chaos and void. And in that sense, it's not just that the world is being judged for how much fruit it's going to get, for its fruitiness, but the world is judged for how much life it's going to get, dependent upon the Jews' acceptance of the Torah. Okay? And so that's a very pertinent idea. But to go back to this idea of creating a buffer in the book of Bamidbar, Rav Moshe Feinstein has this beautiful idea. He first quotes the Ptosis that we just cited for you, and this is in source number 6. He says, "V'nira sheyesh lefaresh Bamidbar shayachut gedola lishvuot." Sefer Bamidbar, or the Parshat Bamidbar, is very, very relevant. It's not just a coincidence that we needed a buffer parsha, so we put Bamidbar in there. Shehu lahotzi me'ila shemitrashlim lilmod v'choshvam shelo yagiu lamadrega gedola batorah. The reason why we read Parshat Bamidbar immediately before Shavuos is to give encouragement to people who withdraw from their Torah study because they think, I'm not such a smart guy. What can I possibly accomplish? What will be my contribution to the great scholarship of Judaism in the larger scheme of things? I'm not so educated. I don't know how to read very well. I don't know how to learn as well. Did you ever see that person give a lecture? I can't even fathom how they know so much. How does that person know so much? How could I possibly even make a dent in Torah study with the little knowledge that I have? Okay, and this will cause a person to sort of withdraw entirely. So he says, "Va'alzeh bi'arti shema shenemar inyan haminyan b'lashon su'u." He says, I've already explained elsewhere, says Rav Moshe, that when the Torah talks about the counting, which is the census that takes place in Parshas Bamidbar and elsewhere in the Torah, it uses the term su'u, which means lift up the heads of all the Jews when you count them. He says, "Shebazem mitnasiim kol echad mimadregato bir'oto shehu shaveh limanot ba'oto hamispar mamash shel hagadol." When you count, when you take a census, there's something quite remarkable, and that is every person counts as one. The greatest scholar and the greatest schlepper are both one. Each person is just one person. Just because you may be smarter than me doesn't mean you get 2 or 3 votes. It's one count per person. Sheshnehem nimnim rak le'echad. Im kain, gam hu yachol lavo lamadrega agdola. And what the Torah therefore is telling us when it tells us to count each Jew as one person is that each person has equal opportunity to grow and to be lifted up and to achieve greatness to the greatest extent of what that person is capable of achieving. V'lachein kodem Shavuot tzarich likro parshat Bamidbar shehu parshat hapekudim shnemar b'lashon nesiyut. That's why we have to take a census before Shavuos to remind us that each Jew is lifted up and is capable of being counted in the same way that even people who are great Talmidei Chachamim are counted. Everyone has the opportunity and has access to greatness. No one is greater than the other in their opportunity to grow and to make a lasting contribution to the Jewish people. Okay, everyone counts. Ish lo nedar, as the Haftorah says, not one person, or not one, every person is like a star, is what the Navi says, and not one of them is not counted. Every single one is counted. Okay, in the last minute that I have, I'll just tell you what the Vishnitzer Rebbe said, Rav Baruch Hager. He also said that the reason why it's Rosh Hashanah, not Rosh Hashanah, but the day of judgment for trees, judgment for fruit, happens on Shavuos, because what is the fruit of the Jewish people? Our kinderlach, our children. Our children are the fruit that we bear. And God judges each and every parent to the extent of how have I educated my children and cultivated the produce of my own orchard. And that is judged on Shavuos, because that's when the Jewish people receive the Torah and not only committed for themselves in Asa v'Nishma, but committed to pass it down faithfully to our fruit, to the fruit of our loins, and to make sure that our children are faithful and are continuing the faith and are continuing Torah education. So think about that. Take some time on Shavuos to connect with your children and as applicable to your grandchildren as well. Okay, that's it. I'm out of time. I wasted so much time today. I'm sorry. Let me wish you a good rest of the weekend. Chag Sameach. All right.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Thank you.
No,
Never always. Thank you.
Right.
take care, everybody. I'm kidding.